Okay, let's get started. All right. So, happy Friday. Just as a reminder, there is no class next Monday. I'm sure you know, but next Monday there is no class because it's the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So all classes are, well, there's no classes, it's a stat holiday. So don't come. I won't be here. No one will be here. I don't even know if the buildings will be unlocked. So that, okay. I also want to apologize for yesterday, for the people who showed up, especially in the morning for the lab. I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but L'Oreal thought the lab was next week, and anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm sorry that people showed up, and that people might have to reschedule things around the change in schedule. The lab that was scheduled for yesterday will be done next week on Thursday, and then everything should be pretty much back on schedule the way it should be. So I do really apologize for that. Mix-ups happen, but I do feel bad especially for the people who show up in the morning, wasting your time, and people who were in the afternoon. I think I got the notice out early enough, but I know it still sucks to have to rearrange schedules, or if you were on campus and that was your only thing, I do apologize for that. Okay, so I think that's everything in the way of announcements. Yeah, no class, sorry. Lab is rescheduled for next week when there was supposed to be no lab, and I'll make sure that I announce that again on Wednesday so that everybody remembers. And L'Oreal and I have made sure that we have all of our dates straight for the rest of the semester, so it will not happen again, and all that stuff. Okay, so today hopefully we can finish up talking kind of in general terms about quantitative research, and then get down to or start kind of with brass tacks on surveys and survey design. Okay, so we ended off last time talking about kind of different forms of measurement validity. And here, I just finish up kind of talking about measurement validity a little bit. As you can see, I closed everything else on my laptop other than PowerPoint. So now my pen is silky smooth and there's no lag. Okay, so in terms of measurement validity, right? Making sure you're measuring the right thing. It's the big concern of quantitative research, because you want to make sure that you're actually measuring what you want to measure. Okay, so here, reliability is also a concern, and maintaining you want reliability and validity, right? So I have a tiny graphic here, which sometimes helps people to sort of understand this. What you're aiming for with your research, right, when you're doing quantitative research, is here, obviously, is sort of in the bullseye area. You want a research project that is both valid and reliable, right? So basically, reliable data will tend to be sort of clustered in a way that sort of makes sense, right? That basically, if you have, you have valid, you're measuring the right thing, so that's critical. You want to make sure that you're measuring the right thing, and that the way that you're gathering the data generates data reliably, that's kind of usable, right? That you're not getting data that's kind of all over the place, that maybe you're measuring it different ways in different circumstances, or that for whatever reason you're getting a real scatter shot of data. So there's a couple of ways this can go wrong, right? You can have not reliable and not valid, right? So if you measure whatever it is, if you're not measuring the right thing and you're not getting reliable results that sort of make some kind of sense, right, that are basically usable because you're measuring them in a consistent way, you would have data that's not reliable or not valid, which you don't want, obviously. Now, sometimes the one that's a little bit more difficult to handle is this one. When, say, your methodology for gathering the data is reliable, right? So you're getting usable and consistent results. The tool is being used consistently and you're getting good data, but your measurement's not valid, right? For whatever reason. Then it's going to look like, you have kind of data that makes sense and it looks like it's usable, but for some reason you've made a mistake in what you're actually measuring. So you're not getting, that measurement validity. So yeah, I mean, this can happen. Sometimes maybe you've misconstrued a concept, or the way you've constructed your research instrument is getting you some other measure. You thought you were measuring religiosity, but you're measuring something else. You thought you were measuring loneliness, but you're actually measuring something else. And you're getting good and consistent results, but you failed to sort of set out or basically conceptualize it in such a way as to get the information that you actually need. So that can happen, and hopefully, it's in your operationalization process that you're going to kind of avoid this sort of problem. By properly operationalizing your variables, you're going to get, to here, hopefully. And then by doing the research properly with, a well-tested methodology that's used consistently, whether it's just by you or by multiple people or through some kind of automated platform. Okay, so yeah, a measure can be reliable but not valid, right? So that's here, and that's a problem. A measure can be invalid, but still reliable. I don't have that on the graph, right? But basically, if it was not valid, what would it look like? I'm trying to conceptualize what it would look like on my target. But basically, if you don't have a valid measure, right, you would have inconsistent gathering of data, right? You're trying, it makes sense the way you've decided to, what you've decided to measure, you're measuring the right thing, but maybe in the way that you're gathering the information, you're not getting reliable data. And this could happen easily, say, you were doing phone interviewing, let's say with surveys, and you had two people who use the tool very differently or who ask the questions differently, or frame the questions differently for people. Potentially you might get data that is invalid because it's not, the research tool isn't being used in a way that's very consistent. So yeah, because it's gathered because it's not gathered, sorry, the data gathered for a research project may be invalid because it doesn't fit with a particular project. Yeah, anyway, sorry, the way I'm trying to read that. Yeah, so gathering it incorrectly, or gathering data that's for something completely different, right? That might be a different sort of piece of information because of the way you're using a tool or because of the way that you're asking a question, right? Or asking a set of questions, some kind of nuances might get you, data that's invalid, but might kind of make sense. Like it might look, kind of like this. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay. All right, so I'm looking forward to getting to surveys because it's a little bit more grounded. So, measurement. I mean, basically the goals of quantitative research, right? We want to measure stuff, and we want to establish causality. So you want numbers. I'm going to make a number sign or numbers. You want to turn things into numbers that can be measured. You want to turn social phenomena into numbers, right? Something that you can measure, something that you can quantify, right? So turning it into a numerical understanding of social phenomenon is the goal. And yeah, causality, or at least correlation, right? We want to understand what causes a social phenomenon and how it's related to other social phenomenon. So we want, here you want direction. You want to figure out your direction. Okay. So, generally speaking, for the most part, when we're dealing with quantitative research, one of the big goals is that you want it to be generalizable, right? So it should apply not just to the group that you interviewed, but it should apply broadly to the population, right? So you don't want to just say something about the particular people who say answered your survey. You want to select the people who do your survey in such a way that they should represent the population, so you can then say, that this is a representation of what we think overall trends are in this population, right? So for instance, when you see national opinion polling, let's say on elections, most of the time, depending on who's doing it, most polling for, say, Canada, we want to find out who people are going to vote for in the election that's probably coming up soon. Most of that polling, right? So you see a poll from Abacus or Leger or CTV or the Globe and Mail or Angus Reid or whoever's doing it. For the most part, they're surveying a relatively small group. Usually somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 people. The goal for them is to select those people in such a way that it represents the whole population, right? So that you can say, these 1,500 to 3,000 people, if we extrapolate that data out, we should see really similar trends amongst Canadians, right? Amongst Canadians in general. So we've picked the right ages, the right demographics, the right regional mix, right? We've got that same kind of mix in our sample. So, yeah, this is of particular concern for researchers using both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs, right? Basically, for both types of research design that you're going to see typically across, say, survey research, cross-sectional where you're just taking a snapshot of today, or longitudinal where you're following a population over time, right? Both of these kinds will want some kind of generalizability, because you want to be able to say, if you're just taking the cross-section, okay, we have a good snapshot of what this population looks like in general for right now, and longitudinally, you want to pick them in such a way as you follow them through time, you can say, yeah, this is a representation, let's say we're picking Canadians, we start when they're in their 20s, and we follow them through until retirement, right? So as you're gathering data in each wave of whatever study you're doing, you want to be able to say, okay, so these are now a representation of how, Canadians from this generation progressed through the life course, right? So as generalizable as possible. And that really comes down to how you select your participants, which I'll talk about briefly here, and then I have a whole section later in the course on probability sampling. Okay, experimental model research is more concerned with internal than external validity. And like I said, you don't need to worry a ton about that, just because, hopefully you're not thinking of an experimental model of sociological research, because it's really, really hard to pull off. So they're more worried about whether it makes sense within the sample than, is it something that we can generalize out to the population, because that's going to be much more difficult to achieve. Okay, and yeah, having a representative sample is essential for generalization. Okay, so a representative sample, very simply, is a representative only from the population from which it was taken, right? So, let's say that you do, Canadians, right? You wouldn't be able to generalize that to Americans. If you said, Edmontonians, you wouldn't be able to say that this is for all Canadians. Teenagers, right? It would only represent teenagers. It wouldn't represent the rest of the population. So representative samples can be of any group that you want, really, but whatever sample you take is going to be representative only of that group, right? And whatever your population is, that's going to be the group that it's representative of. So your population, like I said, can be almost anything. It could be U of A students, it could be people in this classroom, that would be a very small population, YouTubers, teenagers, kids at my daughter's school, anything that you select as your frame is going to be, your population, and that should be what your representative sample is representative of. Okay, so probability sampling. We'll talk about probability sampling in great and possibly excruciating detail. There's a bunch of different ways of doing probability sampling. But basically, when you're doing probability sampling, what you want is to use a random sample drawn from a given population in order to, so that your results aren't skewed, right? So they're truly representative. You want your selection process to be relatively random, right? You don't want it weighted in any particular way based on who you chose. So typically you use some kind of random system to get a sample that is as close to what that real population should look like as possible. Now, random sampling is really difficult. It's actually, I think, especially with survey research, it's actually getting harder because of shifts in technology. It used to be, the way that people did this for, say, phone interviewing is that they would enter, they would do random dialing based within postal codes, right? Because the way cities used to be organized is certain sections of the city had a particular prefix number, right? So like, for instance, where my parents used to live in West Edmonton, not far from West Edmonton Mall, all the phone numbers in that area had 487 as the, so 780-487 and then the rest of their phone number, which I won't tell you because they still use it. So you could be like, okay, we'll take this. We know roughly how many people live within that, and then we're going to randomly dial numbers within that to try and get a sample. Phone obviously don't work like that anymore because we all have, magical rectangles in our pockets that have really shifted things. Plus, people don't answer random phone calls anymore. So this has made it really difficult. But we can talk about that when we get to probability sampling. Internet samples, like what Leger and Abacus and all the others do, they're really hard to get random samples because it's only people that sign up that get your poll, which makes it so hard to get a random sample. So it's getting a lot harder. Even if you have a random sample, it doesn't guarantee representativeness of the sample group, right? You can still have weird ways that it gets skewed. You try a random sample dialing phone numbers, you get more older people because more older people pick up the phone or have a home phone or something like that. But it improves the chances, so it tends to make it better. And you're never probably going to get perfectly random samples, but you want to approach it as best you can. Okay, quantitative research, one of the goals should be replication, right? That basically someone could do the same study as you in a similar kind of circumstance and should get, relatively similar results. So using the same methodology, using the same systems and all of these sorts of things. Sometimes people can do, I think probably now the best replication studies are done from, existing data, because people can just rerun the data and check if you got everything right, if you took everything into account. Those are the easiest ones for replication. In social research, replication is really difficult, right? Because getting the exact same social circumstances as were happening at the time you did your study is essentially impossible. So it's really difficult to do replication studies. But in general, right, quantitative research wants replication because you can check against bias or routine errors, right? People make mistakes, even in the way that they analyze data. And yeah, if something is askew, right, if the findings are not the same as the original study, then sometimes you have to reevaluate methods and the finding of the original study. And sometimes this causes people to go back and look at whether the study was done properly, right? Or whether there was some bias, whether people misinterpreted data or whatever. And this is the onus behind, publishing the data sets so that people can rerun your data and double check your data, right? And increasingly, like I said, Journal of Criminology has said They're not publishing anything where you don't make publicly available your data set. Basically because there's been people who skewed their data purposely or skewed their results purposely, for political reasons. And so that particular journal has lost some trust. Okay, now if the findings are the same, right, generally speaking, you can have greater confidence in the original findings. I guess I'll just clear this off for a sec. An interesting kind of example of this was the very famous marshmallow experiment, right? You're probably familiar with the marshmallow experiment, right? Where they take a bunch of toddlers into a room and they offer them, if they can have one marshmallow right now, or if they wait 5 minutes, they can have 2 marshmallows. And the original study found that, those who waited, so those that they said had better kind of self-control, ultimately, when they followed them several years on, they were doing better. So more self-control equals, better life outcomes. However, other people, did a replication study of this, and what they found was actually very different results, right? They did the same experiment, got very different results, and what did they do? They said, okay, why did we not get the same results, right? What happened here? And what they found, they went back and looked at the original study, and they found that the original marshmallow study basically was relatively homogeneous group, right? So they were all more or less white middle-class kids. And the follow-up study had a much more random sample, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, racial, ethnic backgrounds, and they got very different results. And they said, okay, that original study was methodologically flawed because their sample wasn't representative of the population. So they got certain results for certain reasons. And that's what replication can do. We are right now in a sort of crisis of replication. There's very little incentive to do replication studies because there's just no money in it. Everybody wants to fund the new hot thing. In sociology and psychology, doing replication studies is hard to begin with, and there's no money in it. Even in medicine and pharmaceuticals, there's very little, everybody wants to find something new. No one wants to test old theories. And so there's been a few prominent examples, especially in pharmaceutical research, where they've retested kind of the results of drugs in clinical trials and found that actually the results don't stand up from the original study. And if someone had bothered to do a replication trial, it would have been clear for years that people were giving drugs that weren't as effective as previously hoped. Okay, does that make sense? Great. Okay, I'll say this really quickly because I want to move on to survey research. Quantitative research, so what are some of the critiques? That it fails to distinguish people and social institutions from the world of nature, right? That you're presuming that the techniques and methods of the natural sciences can be applied to societies and people, which is not always the case, right? And critics will say, humans and their actions are different than non-conscious things in the natural world. And therefore, we need different methods that we use to study natural phenomena. And you can't always, you can't quantify a lot of things about humans, right? You can only qualify them. Quantitative researchers will say humans are part of nature, right? There are broad statistical patterns, and therefore you can use quantification and statistics to understand human behavior. Here, one of the other critiques is that even the measurement process that we use in quantification can create an artificial and false sense of precision and accuracy. So if people you never quite know how one individual is going to interpret particular survey items, right? People have different backgrounds, people have different reading abilities. So you might think you have a great survey, but that can be a sort of false sense of precision and accuracy because you don't know what processes went into someone interpreting your question. And yeah, the reliance on instruments and procedures, sometimes makes it seem a little bit too clean and clinical, right? There's a lot of people will question external validity. And yeah, sometimes, especially in experimental research, manipulated independent variables can be small facets of life that have short-term effects. And yeah, it can be really difficult because life is long, ongoing, and there's a lot of shifting social processes. One of the things I always say, I think I say this a lot in both SOC of Religion and SOC of Youth, when people ask me, what's going to happen in the future with, this, that, and the other thing. I say, well, if current trends hold, which they never do, right, this is what would happen. But there's always something that intervenes. And so, life is a deep and deeply shifting process. There's all sorts of unknowns, things that are going to happen in the future that we don't know about, that can shift things in very real ways. And yeah, real life might be very different than what happens in an experiment, which is why, sociologists mostly don't do experiments. Okay. Just analyzing the relationship of variables obviously, reduces people's experiences to numbers, but doesn't tell you anything about how people interpret them, which is why, like I said, almost all the really good research, I think, is multi-method, where we get the qual and quant, and that's why we see so much of it now. So if you're studying the relationship between single motherhood and poverty using a questionnaire, you don't understand what it's like to be a single mother, right? So you can understand the what. I guess quantitative is very good at the what. It's less good, I won't say terrible, so it's good at the what, it's not always great at the why, right? So you can kind of guess at the why, but a lot of times, like I was reading a paper sometime last year, and I remember, they did all this quantitative analysis, they had their many variables, and they said, okay, this is what we think the data is telling us, but to really know, we're gonna have to go, someone needs to go do qualitative research on this subject, right? So really good at general trends, not so great at the why. And yeah, you might not get at the perceptions of people. Your explanations for findings might not address the perceptions of people for whom it's supposed to pertain. They might have really different reasons that they say they're doing something or that they think something than what you're speculating from the data, which you can't really get from the tools we have in quantitative research, which, like I said, is why we get a lot of mixed or multi-methods now. And yeah, quantitative researchers, tend to have this objectivist ontology, right? They assume the social world really exists. Quantitative, and that the social order is fixed. And this, there's going to be people who object to this, saying that there's a lot of constructed elements to society and a lot of things that potentially you can't see, right? So quantitative researchers generally say there might be a social reality that's not perceived, but that we can measure certain things that'll tell us certain things about society, right? So anyway, critiques of quantitative research. Let's stop it there. All right, so I'm going to open up. I got 22 minutes, and let's start something maybe a little bit more grounded than all the theoreticals. Okay, so we're going to talk the specifics of survey research. Okay, now again, survey research is the #1 tool that's used in sociology. There is more survey research that's done than anything else, right? Quantitative or qualitative, it's definitely the top quantitative method. It's used more than any qualitative method as well. It is #1 for lots of reasons. I would say probably the biggest two are scale. You can scale surveys up really big, and cost. They're relatively cheap to run. So you can get a lot of data Oh, and I would say the other one would probably be time. You can get a lot of data very quickly at relatively low cost. And this is very appealing to researchers because, gathering data using other methods can be very time consuming. And we'll talk about when we get to ethnography and interviews how time consuming they can be. Okay, so surveys. You basically have two types of questions within surveys. You have open questions, right? So this is, like I described, like a box where people can type whatever they want, and closed questions where you have the question and, A, B, C, D. So they're presented with a fixed set of alternatives for whatever they choose. They both have their place, and they both have their sorts of, I don't want to say flaws, but limitations. Okay, open questions. The advantages, well, it can allow your participants to tell you things that you might not have thought of. Sometimes in the course of setting up your survey or your research project, you have your particular frame, you think you might already know what you want to know, but sometimes these kinds of open ways of gathering data can be really useful for letting people tell you things you don't know, right? Things you haven't thought about. And so a lot of times what you see with open questions is they're really helpful in pilot studies. And this is probably like if I don't love open questions in the main part of gathering data because they can be quite hard to sort of deal with, right? They can generate a lot of unstructured data, which you don't always have the ability to, or it can be difficult for you to kind of code it and work with it. But it's useful in I find it really useful in pilot studies where you're sort of trying to get, the lay of the land, right? Maybe you're approaching an issue that you don't know a ton about. And in order to get the lay of the land, you do a pilot study. Open data can be really useful because it can allow people to sort of tell you what they know, right? So, it makes it possible to tap unprompted knowledge. What would people tell you if you just let them speak? They might tell you all sorts of things about their attitudes on religion or the University of Alberta or whatever it is your topic happens to be, loneliness, right? So from that, you might actually get, you're going to examine the salience to response, like how important is it to them? And you can then use that later to generate fixed answer or fixed choice format questions or closed questions. So in a pilot study, really useful to let people kind of talk openly. You kind of code that data, usually on a small scale. You code that data, you get a better sense of, maybe where your gaps in knowledge are or what's really important to people, and then you turn that into closed questions. That's probably how I would typically use them. So disadvantages, they're more time consuming for you as a researcher. So it's both for the researcher and the participant. So obviously, as the researcher, you having to read them, code them, kind of try to understand what's within open and unstructured sources of data is much more complicated and time consuming, right? You're going to have to spend more time with it than just, use your code book to create statistical analysis and all that fun stuff. So it's more, it takes more time for you. For participants too, obviously like picking from a list of multiple choice answers versus writing their thoughts in a box is going to take more time as well. So you have to be careful with open questions for your participants, because if you have too many of them and you're asking someone to fill in too much and it's taking too long, your desistance rate is going to be high, right? So more people might exit without completing, and that's obviously a problem because generally that means you can't use their data, right? So it's way less convenient for them to compose an answer which again is going to affect your desistance rate. And this can be like if it's on, online and people are typing, they're just going to quit. I've hung up on people who were doing phone surveys that were taking too long, right? Where it's just like, you said this was going to take 15 minutes. It's been 35. I actually have stuff to do, like, I need to wash my goldfish or something. And so I'm just going to hang up now, except I didn't say that part. I just hang up. So you do want to make sure that it's not taking too long. You have to structure those sorts of surveys quite differently. Yeah, I mean, if you do them in person, right? So if you're doing them over the phone or in person, you might have to transcribe it, which again is a bit of a process. And again, if you're doing this if you're doing this in any circumstance, you could face interviewer or intercoder variability, right? So two different people asking the same question might ask it a little bit differently, or if people ask for clarifications, they clarify it in different ways, and that can affect things. And then when people are coding them, right, there can be differences in how people code, how they interpret what someone said, and which coding categories they put into it. So they're much more complicated, and they have a lot of disadvantages. Okay, closed questions. Literally, I think everything I have for images in this whole thing is just jokes about surveys. I don't know why. Advantages. So with your closed questions, right? So you have your question and you have some kind of scale or some kind of answer set that's available. It'll minimize intra-interviewer variability and inter-interviewer variability. If they're being done, say, on the phone or in person, it's going to be minimized because there's less range for people to interpret, to emphasize different things. If someone's not understanding, you don't really repose a question or try to explain it. So it's just like, answer set, question, answer set. It's pretty simple. For the people doing the survey, it's often easier to understand the questions, right? Because sometimes the answer set will sort of imply what the question is asking. So if they don't understand the question, they look at the answer set and it kind of clears it up. Okay, and this is the big one. Closed questions can be answered quickly and easily, which can reduce response rate issues, right? Because going through this, going through 20 or 30 or even 40 multiple choice questions is a relatively quick thing. So people can do it relatively quickly, as opposed to writing a lot, which is going to take a lot of time and reflection, right? And people are time-strapped. Sometimes they're lazy. Sometimes they didn't really want to do your survey. So closed questions will make it easier for you to get a higher response rate. Okay, now, some of the potential sources of errors with closed questions. Poorly worded questions is probably number one. And sometimes this just comes from, it can be lots of things. Wordy, jargon. Complex answer sets are another one. Oops, answer. Right, so if each option on your multiple choice is like 3 sentences long, complex answer sets can be a problem. Biased questions, right? So my employee satisfaction survey over here, they're pretty biased questions, right? My company rocks. All this stuff. So all of those things can be kind of problems. This one, again, is less of a question because we're moving away from doing them in person and on the phone to more online. But if you're doing, say, phone interviewing or in-person interviewing with a survey, which still happens, interviewer error in asking a question, right? They get a word wrong. They misread the question. That can cause some problems. Again, I think this is much more common. This was much more common in the past, but today everything is moving to online, so it's less common. This one, misunderstandings on the part of the interviewee or the respondent. People may not understand what the question is asking, especially if you get into even well-worded questions. People can misinterpret them. They can think you're asking something different than what you're actually hoping to ask. So this can generally be, it's probably one of your biggest problems. People just misunderstanding questions and therefore answering in a way that doesn't reflect what they actually think. Interviewee lapses in memory, really depending on the kind of question. And some of this can be mitigated by the way you design questions. If you ask certain questions, especially about things too far in the past, people might just not remember. So in thinking of kind of design, and I'll talk about this a little bit later too, when you're thinking about designing your questions, you always want to make sure that it's something that someone could reasonably be expected to remember accurately. And the longer in the past it is, the less certain that is. So you always have to take that into account. People's memory actually is pretty bad for the most part, so you have to take that into account. Okay. Interviewer errors in recording information. So, like I said, this still happens in like the project that the CCR is working on now. They're actually going into prisons and then meeting with people after release and talking to them, and they have an iPad, right, with the survey on them, and the person interviewing is filling it out. So potentially, right, the person filling it out could fill it out incorrectly. They hit the wrong thing, right? If you write it down wrong on a paper. If you were doing paper interviews, we have iPads, so it's a little bit better. But there can be mistakes in how you record information, and that's going to be almost impossible to fix later on. Mistakes in entering the data into a computer file. Again, this would only be the case if, say, you're doing paper. This doesn't happen very often anymore. And it would only be in very, iPads really changed this. Now almost everything is done either computer assisted or using a tablet. So this one is not, I think, a big deal anymore, and it's going to auto upload everything for you. I dropped my pen and it made me sad. Okay. Bias, biases related to characteristics, gender or race of the interviewers or the interviewees, right, could shift the way people answer questions. So they might answer in a biased way that you might not have interpreted or expected. Okay, so other disadvantages, there's no spontaneity, right? You lose spontaneity and authenticity because sometimes a relevant answer might be excluded from the choices you provide. You can use open questions to get around this, but again, they have their own problems. And sometimes people interpret things differently in wordings of fixed responses. The meaning of strongly and strongly agree. And this actually, is a real problem. And I can tell you, okay, let me tell you a story about this. So I used to work at Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is one of the enduring traumas of my life because it was one of the worst places I have ever worked. And I've worked in some pretty crappy jobs. And Enterprise Rent-A-Car was one of the worst. So one of the things that Enterprise Rent-A-Car did at the time, which I don't know if they still do, is they would do randomly they would phone customers and ask them about their rental experience, right? And basically it was, there was like 3 questions on the survey. The only one that actually mattered was how satisfied were you with your rental experience? And the options were completely satisfied, satisfied, neither, somewhat dissatisfied, or completely dissatisfied. Now, if they picked anything other than this, completely satisfied, the branch that they rented it at would get a paper printout on their printer saying, hey, you had one of your customers report that they were something other than completely satisfied. So I remember this happening one time, and it was one of our repeat customers who had rented a car, and they got this phone survey, and they answered this, right? They answered satisfied. And so we got a printout, and our manager had to phone this particular customer and ask, well, what did we do wrong? Like, why didn't you give us a completely satisfied? And the person was like, oh, well, I mean, to be completely satisfied, right, it would have had to have been like a way nice, like it was fine, everything was great, it was good, but it would have had to be like a luxury car for me to be completely satisfied, right? And it was like, okay, their interpretation of the complete and completely satisfied was like, it has to be a magical experience, right? And so especially with these kind of very closely related things, like strongly agree or just agree, people are going to interpret that in different ways, right? And actually, one of the things that happens in all of these is people will almost never choose this. People are much more likely to choose this because there's just a perception that they don't want to be a 5 out of 5, right? That, oh, 4 out of 5 is pretty good, so I'm going to give them that, right? So people will often tend to the, if you have strongly agree and agree, they're going to tend to agree or disagree more than strongly agree or strongly disagree, because the strongly has a kind of off-putting quality to it. It's like, wow, why would it be strongly, right? You'd have to be really feel passionate about it for it to be strongly, and most people are going to go with the less, like disagree or dissatisfied or satisfied, agree or disagree rather than the strongly ones because of the way that they interpret it. So that can skew your data as well. Okay. Sometimes people just don't find a response that they feel applies to them. So this is especially true. Here I will redo this very quickly. This is especially true on a scale like I just said, right? Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, right? If people lack, say, a neutral option, then people might not know how to respond, right? Because sometimes you just don't have a strong feeling about something, so you might not find a fixed response that fits you. Or I'll give you another weird example. My Fitbit. It has this weird feature where it wants to measure my stress. And so every couple of hours, it will be like, we recorded a change in your something or other. I don't even know. And it's like, can you tell us how you're feeling? And it's like, I'm feeling stressed, calm, there's a list of things. And often I just kind of look at it and I'm like, none of those are how I'm feeling. None of these actually represent, I'm like, I don't know, I'm just kind of like, meh. Is there a meh option on my Fitbit? So, there's times where, lacking sort of a neutral option, or the options you listed just don't fit how the person actually feels, right? So you don't always find a fixed response that applies to you, which means that you're just like, well, I mean, with my Fitbit, I'm just like, yeah, I'm not going to answer this time. So I think my Fitbit thinks I'm always stressed because I only answer when I'm stressed, because I'm like, ooh, that fits. But if I'm just like, whatever, I don't answer because nothing on the watch actually fits that. So that's one of the problems with a fixed response too. You don't always think of every possible option, and you couldn't list 100 different things because no one would ever answer your questions because there's too many options. So sometimes you end up in that situation. Okay, we had 2 minutes. Should we just leave it here? Let's just leave it here because these are different types of questions. We'll come back to this on Wednesday. So don't come back until Wednesday. Well, so we'll see you next week. We'll wrap up a little early. We'll be good. Okay.